Welcome to Anita Talks History and Genealogy. Before we begin, please, if you like this video, hit the like button. Please hit the share button, hit the subscribe button, and continue to comment, especially positive comments. If you have information that you want to share or you want to like, we want to keep it uplifted because this is a station, a channel that is sharing information for those who may not have that information or who do have that information and want more information. So we want to keep it positive and upbeat. I'm not here to knock anybody else's beliefs or traditions or even information that you may have. I'm here to teach, to share. I've written 7 books, 7. And the books are about my researching and documenting the history of my Indigenous ancestors here in the Americas. Before I started writing that book, I got information from my mother who gave me the oral traditions of our family on that side of the family and told me as much as she knew. And then I began researching and documenting because it was upsetting to me to hear that although we were Native American on my mother's side of the family, that we could not, in any instance, put down that we were Indian or the name of the tribe we belonged to or anything like that. Those Europeans who came and colonized the region where my ancestors were, called us Mulatto Colored Negro and or Black. They called us what they decided we were, what was convenient for them. And we were not allowed to change anything on our birth certificates. We, other than our oral traditions, had nothing in writing, you know. I'm not going to say nothing in writing. There was writings, but they were scattered. And that's why it took me 30 years to go and dig up what was hidden, go and look in those historical records in Virginia and in Pennsylvania, to go to the National Archives and do research. I did a lot of research with the ancestry. Before there was an ancestry DNA, there was the Mormons. They were archiving racial backgrounds of people, and I heard that they were doing it because they didn't really want people that look like me, to be members or to be full members of the Mormon Church. That is what I heard. You know, um, I didn't go research that, but from what I learned, even from former Mormons or Mormons themselves, it was true. And it may be true to this day. I don't know, but they're no different than any other of the people who colonized uh, the Americas. You know, they're just following the traditions that were set up when they began the colonization of the Americas. In other words, so who do we associate being colonized with? The Romans, uh, France, England, and then those other, some other European countries that come in and followed suit. Germany, um, you know, those, and of course Spain and Portugal. You know, it just seemed like that's all Europe is, a place where the colonizers come from. You know, so what I wanted to talk about, or what I'm going to talk about today, is how we lived growing up, not being able to claim that part of our ancestry because over the years I've come across, many natives who were raised on a reservation. Um, um, I've been on the reservation at Standing Rock, where the natives are. We were there in the dead of the winter. It was freezing cold, but the people that I saw there were so vibrant and full of life, and they just whatever the weather conditions were, because we were going and standing with them, against these oil companies. Um, and when we were there was indigenous people from all over the world that came to support Standing Rock. Um, and that to me was so spiritual and so beautiful that being there in the dead of the winter did not bother me, you know. And I'm serious about the cold. That that cold, you're breathing it in and then it's coming right out of your mouth, and it was cold. But just seeing the people there and the people coming from all over the world to support Standing Rock, that was beautiful to me. And that was the first time that I've been on a reservation and I've seen um, the way that the people lived, and it was it's a hard life. It's a hard scrabble life. The way that we lived growing up was it was in a family that was Christianized. So I'm saying this, that we were supposed to be, as these colored people, as these Negro people, Christians. So we were raised in the church. So there was my mother and my father. My father worked in a steel mill, and he, he was able to maintain a household because things were not that expensive. He had been in World War II. He came back. He was a veteran, um, and he worked at the VA hospital, and he worked at the steel mill. When I was growing up until the age of 12, my dad had at least two jobs, and he was always trying to start a business so that he could be independent and not dependent on this system. You know, he, you know, he paid his taxes. He was very political and voted. And and my mother stayed home. So, she was always in the house when she sent us to school. Um, we come home, she was there. What she did to make money was her crafts. So my mother would, any kind of craft that you could think of, as far as she could knit and she could crochet. So she would knit and crochet. She would bake, make baked goods and sell them. And my aunts who were working outside the home would ask her to, knit and crochet for them. Also, she would sew. We always had a little Singer sewing machine. So she would do her crafts and make money from them. She made hats. So she would make hats for the church that we went to for my aunts who worked. So they would come and have their meeting in the house and tell her, you know, they called her Vivian because that was my mother's name. And they would ask her about, what kind of material she had. They would tell her what kind of, hat they wanted for church. And she would get it. She would get the material and she would make the hats and sell them. And they paid her. So my mother always had pin money. And she was always, you know, um, if she didn't sew something, or make it from scratch, she would order it from the Sears catalog. So she would order us dresses and clothing item from the Sears catalog. And So this is how we lived, and most of the people in our community, that's how they lived. Um, and it worked until, my mother and father separated, and we were literally on our own. And that's when things, really changed, and we saw just how the system worked against a female on her own trying to survive with children. Well, yeah, with children. And it was hard. And I just hate I did not like seeing my mother, you know, um, suffering, going through the fact that she was now a single woman and she had been married most of her life, depending on, um, you know, outside outside sources in order to survive. So we were making it. We were just barely making it, and there was not a lot of thought about who we were, other than the fact that we had moved to another community that was more racist than the one we came from, or maybe I was more aware because that was when I was like 12 years old, and I was more aware of the racism from the white people who owned the factories, who controlled our means of, our means of survival. Um, Forget about welfare. You were not allowed to get welfare because my mother and father did not divorce. Even though he left her, she did not believe in divorce. And as long as she was still married to him, it was up to him to support us or not. She wasn't going to go you know, um, through the courts to force him to pay child support. So um, this is the mindset. This was in the 50s and 60s, and this was the mindset of my mother and a lot of the women in the community whose husbands had left them or who were single, not by choice, but through circumstances they had no control over. And the beautiful thing about that community is that they supported each other. You know, um, my mother began cleaning houses, and so that's what she was doing too. Whatever she needed to do to, help us sustain ourselves and survive, she did it. And then she became a nurse, and she, was working in a nursing home, and she became a licensed practical nurse at that time. That was just below a registered nurse, and so that is how my mother sustained herself. Um, and we were not talking about what our ethnicity was. At that point, it was, there was no talk about, um, us being native or anything like that. That had ended. Um, so we moved from Pennsylvania, where I grew up, to California. And that is when, you know, things really, started changing, um, where there were more job opportunities, where there was more education. And so it was better. It was better, but it wasn't home because my mother had told us that Pennsylvania was where our native and indigenous ancestors came from. And so my mind was still on Pennsylvania, even though we were now living in California in the Bay Area. Um, and so at some point, um, things started getting better, you know. Um, and My mother and I were living together. She was living in my house, actually in Oakland. Um, and she told me that she had been writing letters about our ancestors. I didn't even know that she, still thought about those things. Um, I'm gonna go back and say this: that at 51 years old, my father died of colon cancer, and that was one of the reasons why his abandonment of us was taking place. Where his whole life he had worked, and he worked in a steel mill, and I'm telling you that back then they didn't have any union or nothing. that he probably got the cancer from working in that steel mill. But when he had to go into the hospital with the cancer, the steel mill fired him, and he had no one to fight for him. And so, while as he was dying of cancer, he was still working. At one point, he was a cab driver. He was being treated by the VA, the Veterans Administration, but he still had to work. He didn't have he didn't there was no retirement funds, there was no um, unemployment, there was no disability. Um, we were just, on our own. And so once he passed away, there was Social Security, for my mother and my baby sister, who was at that time still, still underage. So so we moved to California, and California is where that I began doing the research that I needed to do to start to document the oral history that my mother had told us about. Um, and, she said that we were in Berks County, and she was saying, "Oh, my ancestors, my great great grandfathers were in the Civil War out of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania." And she told me about an incident that had taken place with where they fought back against the militia that was coming in looking for escaped slaves over, the border from Virginia. And so when she was saying that prior to the Civil War, our ancestors were free, basically. And I was like, wow, if they're free, if they were free, then they probably, there's probably some records of, when they got free, because we're assuming they didn't just get free. Okay. But um, they were born free, come to find out. I got all of their records for the United States Colored Troops. They were involved in the United States Colored Troops, and before that, Frederick Douglass was their leader. He would come down into Lancaster County and talk to the free blacks that were there. They called them free blacks. Okay, so I got all their I found those records. I found records of other of our ancestors who were in Chester County, Pennsylvania, who were in the United States Colored Troops. And eventually, and this was when, the archives, there were archives in Oakland up at the Mormon Temple. They had a library. And so I was able to use that library to find that information. And the information that I was looking for in Pennsylvania, as far as who was Native and, you know, uh, what was the race, it eluded me for many, many years because they had my ancestors, who my mother said was Native, as mulatto. So um, I used her oral history to trace those natives up into Canada during the Revolutionary War. And it was the Iroquois, the Mohawk. And she had said, "Oh, my great great grandmother was a Mohawk." And so I'm looking at the Onondaga village, I mean, the Onondaga reservation in Canada to see those surnames. And those surnames were there, just like she said they would be. Um, they kept um, the last names. Like one of the prominent names, besides Martin, was Davis, you know, and those surnames, and Green, all of those surnames from my ancestors were in the Onondaga village, and I still are in the Onondaga village in Canada. Um, so I use that information to trace, to find them. and they had been sent to Canada after the Revolutionary War because the Iroquois fought on the side of the British. And that's not surprising. And I want folks to stop and think about being colonized and how they were successful. They were successful in dividing and conquering. And the reason they were successful was because no one expected to have something so evil and wicked come into your presence. So they kind of surprised the Native people, just like they surprised the African people. You would be, if you've never seen the depravity of killing women and children, of raping women, then it's beyond your comprehension. It's beyond an explanation because those words did not exist prior to colonization. The brutality of these people who called themselves Christian is beyond description. So I do not say, those natives should have been stronger. They should have known better. Well, we know better because we can look back and see. We have situations that we've dealt with these people. So we're not surprised at their wickedness and the things that they do and how they pass laws that they themselves don't even live under, how they can say they are Christians and know nothing about the Bible, its origins, even the books of the Bible, or the Ten Commandments, all of which they demand that we live by, and they don't live by. One of the Ten Commandments is thou shalt not kill. Please look at what's going on in Palestine, in the Sudan, in the DRC. And yes, there are people from the Middle East who should be doing more to stop the genocide in Palestine. But look at the origins of it. Look at the origins of what is going on in the Sudan. They came into Africa with the plan to subjugate the people by any means necessary. You all thought that Malcolm X come up with that? This is these people's manifest destiny by any means necessary, and that means to lie, steal, destroy, and dominate and covet. You know, that's another. Isn't that another one of the Ten Commandments? Not coveting what other people have. Yeah, they do all of that. Break every one of the Ten Commandments and then look in your face and try to tell you that you're less than they are, that they are somehow superior. In what universe? Anyway, so back to, how we were living. We were living hidden. Nobody was going to say out loud when I was growing up that they were Native. And one of the reasons had to do with the fact that when my ancestors came back from the Onondaga Reservation into Pennsylvania, they were redesignated as mulatto. They could not come back as Indian or saying that they were Susquehanna or Mohawk or Seneca. They had to come back as mulatto, colored, Negro, or Black. And if you did not go, or come under those descriptions, then you were probably going to be sent to a reservation. So we have the Lenape. Some of my ancestors are Lenape who were sent to Oklahoma to the reservation, but they're actually from the Delaware Valley, and the ones who stayed, even those who claimed, mulatto or colored or whatever, or were called that, lived in poverty. We didn't live in poverty when my dad and mother were alive, but we were just above the line. The reason that we were living well when my father and mother were together was that we had grandparents, we had aunts and uncles, and everybody would help each other. So we were actually a village helping each other, making sure that, if somebody in the community was hungry, they were fed. If there was somebody, if the kids need clothes, my parents and other people in the community got together and made sure that they had school, those children who were orphans or whatever had school clothes. For a long time, my father um, was a member was a member of the Masons. He left at some point. I don't know why he left or what happened, but um, so they all were supportive of my father at that point. Uh, but when we moved to Reading, Pennsylvania, um, and we were on our own, my mother didn't ask for help because she felt like she didn't want people in her business. So there we go. And I still, I can understand that. If she being a woman who was had a husband that was taking care of her, and that she was embarrassed. So, today I can look back and understand that, especially since I myself have been in a similar situation. So, as far as the natives, and talking about, who you were and revealing um, that part of our ancestry, there were people in the community who knew, and they would say, "Oh, your your people are from the mountains," and they were talking about the Welsh Mountains. See, that's the Martins and the Greens, and that's the Johnsons, and that part of our they knew who those people were, and people in the community said, "Oh, you're the Martins, you're the Greens, you're the Davises, you're the Johnsons." They knew who the natives were in our community. And another thing that happened, my grandfather, Martin, my mother's dad, went to a Quaker school and he was allowed to grow his hair long. Um, if he had been, if he wasn't in the Quaker school, they would have sent him to a mission school because I met relatives who were sent to mission schools. That was later on down the line. But my grandfather, Martin, he was an only child. Um, and, you know, so she sent him to Quaker school. They worked for the Quakers. His father, my great grandfather, was a rancher. Um, he worked for the Quakers, the Darlingtons, and I come to find out later those Darlingtons are actually related to us and are married into those people, into my native, family members on that side of the family in Pennsylvania. So my mother was saying there, there are a lot of our family who are passing. So they would go up. I know what county they lived in too. I'm not going to say it because I understand now why they were passing. Because the poverty, um, if you were poor and they knew who you were and you were colored or you were mulatto on that, they were keeping records and they would put you in a workhouse, a boarding school, or they would arrest you. That is how they were able to control. And when I say they, I mean the Quakers too. I don't just mean the other Europeans, I mean the Quakers too. And if you go and look at the Chester County records, from the time that they founded the county, which was in the 1600s, when they found us, our native ancestors there, they were writing up ways to get the land, from the native people. So if you're in Chester County, probably Berks too. I haven't, really looked at a lot of their records, but Chester County, I've looked at their records, and I've gone to the archives in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And what they were doing is they were taking the children and putting them in orphanages. They were, um, if you were considered to be loitering or not working, they would put you in a workhouse, and they could also put you in jail. So that's where our people were. That's where they were. And hiding in plain sight. And the poverty, it was a grinding kind of a poverty because people, were either living in shacks or they were exposed to the weather. And it gets really, really cold in Pennsylvania. So I think this is important to share. I want people to know what was going on and to open your eyes and look around and think about why people were in poverty and what they did to keep us from living freely on our ancestral lands. You know, another thing that they did is there's an Indian village in Williston, Pennsylvania, in Chester County, Pennsylvania. There's what they call a Okie tract, 500 acres that William Penn promised to Queen Aliquippa for the native people to live freely. Um, they and when William Penn left, the white settlers came in with guns and ran the natives off again, off of that land. And on that land was taken by Quakers, is occupied by Quakers, and was given to an AME church. So an AME church was built on that land. And there's an AME church and a graveyard with some of my ancestors there. My Johnson ancestors are there, and they were Native people who were intermixed with the Quakers. So, and I just felt it was important today to share this information. These are like the ins and outs that I found, and I want to let you guys know, especially the ones who are still researching, look at those types of things. Go and look at the county records of where your ancestors were and see what they were calling them. Because they didn't call them by their tribe, or they didn't, sometimes they would say Indian, but they were calling them other things, but they did not call them African. Okay? And that's what I'm going to leave you all with today. And thank you for joining me. And don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment. And I will try, if you have questions to ask, I will try my best to answer them. And I will be back. I will check with you all later. And everyone, have a good